Against a backdrop of global uncertainty and proliferating crisis, the Africa CEO Forum Annual Summit will be held on the 5th and 6th of June in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. This year, more than ever before, the need to build self-sustaining, resilient, and prosperous African economies will be a priority for those attending Africa's largest annual private sector gathering with the theme, Navigating the Crisis from 300 to 3,000, How to Deliver the Next Generation of African Champions. Founded in 2012, the Africa CEO Forum has evolved from a purely annual event to a permanent platform through which African decision makers can connect with each other continuously, as well as with international investors and institutions operating on the continent. Joining us now is Amir Ben Yahmed, President of the Africa CEO Forum and CEO of Jeune Afrique Media Group. Good morning, Amir. Thank you for joining us on the morning show.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to see you again. Tell us more about the Africa CEO Forum. Let's start with that.
I followed your previous conversation and your discussion about the Ghanaian accent. I hope you will like the Tunisian accent, since I'm coming from Tunisia. No, more seriously, so the Africa CEO Forum today is the largest private sector conference. We have created this conference in 2012 with the idea of gathering all of Africa's private sector to kickstart an agenda where the private sector would be the main leaders of growth in Africa. So we gathered African CEOs, DFIs, policymakers, institutional investor, all around of this agenda of a private sector-led growth. And it has been now a formidable platform of public-private dialogue. We are gathering every year around 1,800 participants from the different countries of Africa. We have almost 30 countries represented each year, and we will be expecting around also 1,800 participants this year in Abidjan on 5th and 6th of June.
All right, thank you very much. So this year, your theme mention is growing the number of African champions, like you said, from 300 to 3,000. Can you expand on this? What does that mean?
Yes, this is a very important thing. I think we kickstarted last year a conversation around the importance for Africa to start this economic sovereignty agenda, because we're in a very complicated political economic context at the time already. It was culminating with the Russia-Ukraine war. And in the last year, the situation has even worsened, since now we have also strong economic tensions, as you have seen in the US with the failures of several regional banks, with the crash in 48 hours of Credit Suisse. We had a bond market crash in the UK. So we really understand that the economic situation is going to worsen. So we're going to have scarcity of financial resources, and we're going to stay very likely in a very likely complicated environment. And so the urgency for Africa to build its economic sovereignty is really in front of us. So now that we have said that, we need to put on the agenda the fact that to build economic sovereignty, we need a strong private sector. Because if you look at the G7 economies, for example, Japan, South Korea, France, Germany, China, the US, their strength, their power comes from the dense and powerful networks of companies that are leaders in strategic industries. And we can create all the plans we have. If we don't have the private sector actors to rely on, we will not be able to address our issues. So that's the main focus that we want to put in this year's agenda: how to build, how to develop our portfolio of $1 billion plus company. There's a very strong indicators that shows how important that is. If you look at the last 5 years in South America and Asia, the growth of the number of $1 billion plus company in the last 5 years were around 30% over that period. In that same period in Africa, it has been almost a standstill. We have around 300 to 350 $1 billion company. I think Nigeria has around 25 to 30, and this number needs to grow and to grow faster.
All right, I must say your Tunisian accent is really lovely. All right, that's a commendation. Let's talk about this. You know, in growing company and growing scale, I'm happy about the fact that you talked about Africa with its vast resource, but we don't have a lot of $1 billion company, which is a sad reality for us. There's a role of government in all of this. Regulations, upstarting the economy, governmental policy and all of that. In all of this conference, what's the role of government? Because yes, they do a lot of harm or disharm.
It's a very, very important point. We can have the best private sector in the world. If we don't have the best policymakers in the world, we're going to go nowhere. When we're talking about economic sovereignty, the main issue is we have two issues. One, how for some of the best positioned economies, how to grab a fair share of global value chains. If your country, for example, in North Africa, is located close to Europe, it has some of the assets, which industry can it build so that they grab this part of global value chain, whether it's to export automobiles or create subcontractors for the aerospace industry. So this is a first issue. The second issue for Africa is how to create local value chains in some strategic sectors, such as, for example, food and healthcare, where we need to be autonomous. So the role, to go back to your question, the role of policymakers is essential because they're in charge of drafting public policies, sector-specific policies that will help address that situation. And of course, in that the second part of their work is to see how to implement that, and then we go back to creating national champions in the various industries we want to be competitive in.
Okay, Amir, let me ask you, how can the Africa CEO Forum contribute to achieving the objective of growth and development in Africa? And why is it that this CEO Forum has never been held in Nigeria? The giant of Africa. When are you going to consider hosting the event here in Nigeria?
I don't want to go back to your previous conversation about the, let's say, anemic growth that Nigeria had under the previous administration. And I think a lot of hopes are now in President Tinubu's next administration to address the issues that we have been speaking about. To go back to the first question, the role of the CEO Forum. You're asking me not to be very modest on that, but when we created the CEO Forum, it was a time when presidential delegation went to travel elsewhere, there were no CEOs at all in their delegation. It was only minister, policymakers, etc. And at the time when we created also the CEO Forum, the question of regional integration was not on the agenda. We gathered from every part of Africa since 2012. Many CEOs. We helped draft relationship. We helped draft deals. We helped created a relationship between Cameroon, Côte d'Ivoire, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Nigeria, Côte d'Ivoire. We've had a tremendous participation from Nigeria in our events. At least 15% of participants are from Nigeria. We have a lot of your companies participating in the events. I hope we will have you, of course, at Abidjan with us and in the coming 2 or 3 weeks. So we would, of course, love to host the CEO Forum in Nigeria. Of course, Nigeria with Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, and South Africa, they're representing 50% of the continent's GDP. So the health situation of Africa is also very connected to the strength of the Nigerian economy. So we sometimes have a dicton: when Nigeria sneezes, Africa catch a cold. But that's very important for us that Nigeria is in good shape, that Nigeria is a driver of growth, that Nigeria addresses many of the issues that are on the table regarding the food system, the power system, being a player in renewable energy, and getting rid of the oil dependence in general. So these are the kind of conversation we would love to have one day in Lagos or Abuja.
Well, we're looking forward to welcoming you to Nigeria. So perhaps the next edition, Nigeria would be considered as the destination of choice. But let me ask you about some of your initiatives. Reading about, just looking at the Africa CEO Forum, what interests me, of course, is your attention to gender parity, especially getting women on boards across Africa. And this also forms a big part of your forum, and you have conversations and fringe events around that. Can you shed a bit more light on that, for what's in it for women on boards and how to increase participation of women on boards?
Yes, this is an initiative that we kickstarted in 2016, if I do remember. That was very important to us. We are holding on the fringe of the event, or within the event, 2 or 3 panel session, workshop session, and we're doing this work all year long. The idea is for us is to do 2 things. First, to create a strong network of women leaders in business position, whether they're owner of their own companies or top executive in multinational corporations or multinational African corporations. And we want them to engage with us in helping spruce up the conversation regarding representation of women in executive committees and boards, and we also engage them into mentoring operations with young professionals. So this is a very important part of the forum. We have also another initiative dedicated to family businesses, because we also consider that they're a very intricate part of the network of company, and they need to have some conversation on succession, governance. As you know, a lot of African companies are privately owned. There was a first generation, and now we're getting to sometimes a second, sometimes a third generation, and are strong issues of legacy transmission, and some countries are really suffering from the lack of depth in their or knowledge or discussion on how to effectively manage transition within family businesses. So, as you have mentioned, we are trying to address various communities within our forum because they're all important components of the growth narrative of Africa, and that's what we are trying to do every year, and more in our digital webinars that we hold all year long.
So, in the quest for this more $1 billion African companies, the problem has always been inter-African capital, because most of these companies still get their capital from abroad. And there's something I wrote about many years ago I call the Delaware effect, especially with the Nigerian tech sector, where most companies are registered in Delaware. I mean, I can see you chuckling and smiling because you know what I'm talking about. How can we have a lot of inter-African companies that have inter-African credits and reduce this over-dependence on Delaware?
Okay, the Delaware thing is a specific take issue, and on the take subject, you really underlined a very strong point, because what's the point of creating companies, powerful tech companies, if we are going to sell them to international investors? So there's really the question of how to build a strong African ecosystem, and instead of having private equity investor from the US or from any other country, how can we create and raise awareness for our numerous wealthy African investor about the importance of the tech sector and trying to keep it as African as possible? Outside of tech, of course, the main question is how to mobilize African capital. So this is, of course, a strong issue. It's probably going to need to be addressed by the CFTA discussions because, as you know, there are many rules that regulates the transfer of capital in Africa. For example, an insurance company that collects money in Nigeria or in Côte d'Ivoire needs to put that money in Côte d'Ivoire or in Ghana, and this is a main factor that slows the good allocation of capital. But this is definitely a very, very important conversation that needs to be done. And that's the role of the CEOs, that's the role of the media, to try to put them on the agenda, because as you know, you have an excellent network, highly, very well watched and considered. You know that policymakers, they need to see some of the files that are on their desk on your show, so that they think that they need to address it more swiftly and more quickly.
Okay, Amir, just before we go, let me ask you a political question. Some North African countries hardly ever want to identify as African. Morocco, we've seen Morocco, we've seen Egypt, during World Cup, during other incidents. Do you have that challenge with organizing this Africa CEO Forum?
Not really, because I think actually what you're raising is an important question in terms of our about the CFTA agenda. We are all strong believers of United Africa. I think one of the issues for Africa is to be represented on the international stage. We have had a really strong lack of leadership in the last years, coming from the African Unions, coming from potentially also the AFDB. These are two institutions that should be very vocal in addressing the fact that Africa is being mismanaged in various aspects. If you look, like, for example, in the financial industry, there's a very big problem, which is the correspondent banking, as most of the international companies, banks have withdrawn from Africa and is increasingly withdrawn their back office work towards African banks. This is a situation that is totally unacceptable, and I don't see any political lead, any political drive to address that issues. Right. So just to really answer, I think we as media people, we as business leaders, we need to have absolutely an African agenda and trying to bypass our national interest to get to make this successful Africa a reality.
Well, thank you very much for your time this morning. Amir Ben Yahmed, Chief Executive Officer, Jean Afrique Media Group, the host of Jean Afrique Media Group, the host of Africa CEO Forum. Thank you for your time.